Probably the best known section of Plato's Republic is his Allegory of the Cave. And here's basically how it goes. You've got people who are chained in a cave. They can't look to either side. They can't move. All they can do really is look at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them there's a walkway. And then behind the walkway there's a fire. Now, from time to time, things go walking across the walkway, or they go moving across the walkway. So, for example, let's say a horse goes across the walkway. Well, then the fire that's behind the walkway casts the shadow of the horse onto the wall in front of the people who are chained. And so the people who are chained, they see the shadow of the horse. Or suppose people carry plants across the walkway. Then they see the shadows of the plants. They see the shadows of the people. People carry a sofa across the walkway. They see the people, they see the shadows of the people, they see the shadow of the sofa. And they take the shadows to be the real things. So they're just seeing a shadow of a horse, but they think that's an actual horse. They see a shadow of a sofa, but they think that that's the real thing, that's a sofa. Well, one day, one of these people gets out of the cave, breaks free and gets out of the cave, and goes outside into the sunlight. And the sunlight, of course, is very painful at first, but after a while, the person's eyes adjust, and now this person sees a real horse. And he realizes, oh, that's what a real horse looks like. What I thought was a real horse was just a shadow of a horse. And the person sees a sofa. And he says, oh, that's what a real sofa looks like. What I thought was a real sofa was just a shadow of a sofa. And this is Plato's idea that this world is the world of shadows. And that most people are like the people in the cave. They just see shadows. They don't see reality. For Plato, the things we see in this world are sort of images of the real thing. The real thing exists outside this world. Reality is outside this world. And it's the true philosopher who sees reality. It's the true philosopher who sees the light, who sees this world in light of the light, right? And that person's job is to go back into the cave and to try to help the people in the cave to have a better understanding of reality, right? And so this person has been pulled into the sunlight, and this person is gaining a knowledge of what's right and what's true, what's beautiful, all these things that we've discussed, right? And notice that this being in the light, that this knowledge of the light, that this living in the light, that this walking in the light, demands something of this person. This person now has to do something. And Plato says that one of the things this person needs to do is to go back into the cave to try to enlighten others. And so being in the light requires some action, right? Okay, so that's a classical Greek idea from Plato. Let's go to an early Christian idea. Well, let's look at some early Christian ideas. And so here's a passage we've seen before. In the beginning was the Word, right? In the beginning was the Logos. We've discussed this before. In the beginning was the logic of everything. In the beginning was the reason. In the reason for everything. In the beginning was the order of everything, right? And then we're talking about a person. So we're talking about a person who embodies the Logos. And of course, it's early Christian document, so we're talking about Jesus Christ. So in the beginning was Jesus Christ, the Logos. And the Word, Jesus Christ, was with God and also was God. So God, the Logos, Jesus Christ, same thing. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and then notice this, and that life was the light of all mankind. There's that idea of light, okay? And so that light is God. That light is the source of everything that's made. For Plato, that light is attached to the divine. That light is attached to truth with a capital T. These conceptions are different, but there's a little bit of overlap in sort of how Plato and the early Christians think about the light. Let's look at some other early Christian documents. This comes from a short book called 1 John. God is light. In him there's no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and don't live out the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. Now notice that, but if we walk in the light, right, we have a choice. And if we are in the light, if we decide to be in the light, then we need to do something. And this passage indicates that one of the things that we'll do as a result of being in the light is have fellowship with one another. So just as in the case of Plato, being in the light, living in the light, being plugged into the light, so to say, that comes with responsibilities, going back into the cave and helping to enlighten other people. In this case, being in the light also seems to require some action. Look at this next passage from Ephesians. You were once darkness, but now you are light. That's interesting. Not you are in the light, but you are light. Live as children of the light. So that's interesting. You are light. Now live as what you are, which seems to imply some choice. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Find out what pleases the Lord, right? So it's interesting. You are light, but you don't yet have full knowledge about what pleases the Lord. Find out what pleases the Lord. So that's an interesting statement from this early Christian document. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. Interesting. Let's go back to Plato. Plato says that a person who has seen the light, so to say, who lives in the light, wants to find a way to live his or her life here on earth without becoming tainted by immoral deeds, and to depart from life confidently and without anger and bitterness. Well, that sounds kind of similar to what we just read, right? If you're living an enlightened life, then you don't want to, what does it say back here? Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. And Plato says we don't want to be tainted by immoral deeds. There seems to have some similarity there. So let's look at these passages side by side. The Christian document, live as children of the light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, and find out what pleases the Lord. Plato. The enlightened person wants to find a way to live his or her life here on earth without becoming tainted by immoral deeds. Notice that both translations here give us that verb to find, right? Find out what pleases the Lord. It seems to imply you're in the light, but you don't yet know everything that pleases the Lord. Find out what does. Plato says, oh, here we have a person who has seen the light. He's plugged into the light, right? But still he needs to find a way to live his or her life here on earth without becoming tainted by immoral deeds. Okay? Now, Plato's philosophy and early Christianity are different things. We want to be careful to say these aren't the same things. But what we're noticing is that there are some ideas in common. So if we want to find out, if we're early Christian and we want to find out what pleases the Lord, if we are a student of Plato and we want to find out how to get through this life untainted by immoral deeds, then what do we need? What do we need to be able to do that well? And I think one thing that the ancient Hebrews, I think one of the things that the ancient Christians, I think one of the things that Plato and Aristotle would all agree on is that people need wisdom. People need wisdom. If we're going to get through this life as well as we can, then we need wisdom. The Greeks agree on that. The Hebrews agree on that. The early Christians agree on that. So what do we mean by wisdom? And as with all these discussions, I think if we have a discussion with Aristotle about wisdom and then have a discussion with an ancient Hebrew writer about wisdom, there will be some differences, but there's some overlap as well. And wisdom has to do with first principles, right? So we could think of wisdom as the stuff of the Logos, what we've talked about a number of times before. This idea that there's a moral law built into the universe. The Logos is the moral law. The Logos is divine reason, right? The Logos is the law of God. Sort of the most basic moral laws, the the first principles, the first moral principles, right? And wisdom is about knowing what those principles are. What are the first principles? What is the moral law? What are the demands of the moral law? So that's one thing we need, wisdom. And then the next thing we need, or another thing we need, is prudence. And what prudence is the ability to act on first principles in daily life. So you have first principles, and then prudence is, okay, well, how do I act on that first principle in this particular situation? Let's take the case of anger, right? And other words that are related to anger: annoyance, vexation, irritation, rage, being ticked off, wrath, being miffed, fury, upset, irked. Suppose you're at work and a fellow employee comes to you and says, oh, the boss is upset. Well, that means something. Suppose your fellow employee comes to you and says, the boss is enraged. Ooh, that has a different meaning. Suppose the fellow employee comes to you and says, the boss is annoyed. Okay. Or suppose the fellow employee comes to you and says, the boss is furious, right? Now, what if it turns out that whatever the boss is upset about, right, as you learn about it, you say, well, I would understand if the boss was annoyed, but the boss is furious. That doesn't seem right. And so we say that the boss overreacted. In other words, we recognize that a reaction was okay, but it seems that the boss overreacted. Or what about another case where something happens and the boss, you think the boss should be furious about this, but actually the boss is just kind of miffed. And you think, gosh, that's an underreaction, right? Why isn't the boss angry? And what this gets at is that, sometimes it's complicated in the world because somebody will get furious and will say, gosh, I don't think, you're kind of overdoing it here. Or in another case, perhaps less common, you think, you really, really should be upset about this, but you seem to be just slightly annoyed, right? It's not always easy to know how to respond. One of the things that's interesting is when you look at early Christian writing and you just, look, as I did, at just how this word anger is used in early Christian writing, it's interesting how complicated it gets. So we have this early Christian document, the book of James, and here's what that says. Dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. Implies there are reasons to be angry, but be slow in getting there, right? If you have a good reason to be angry, okay, but, take your time getting there. Well, let's look at this other passage from an early Christian document called the letter to the Colossians. In this case, the writer says, you need to rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, malice, rage, slander, etc. In this case, it seems to be saying you need to not be angry at all. Although if you look at the context, the next word is rage, the next word is malice. Seems to imply we're talking about, a very, very intense kind of anger. The third passage comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, early Christian document. And here it's talking about Jesus. And it says that Jesus looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, right? So here we have a case where Jesus is said to be angry. And then in the fourth passage from a letter to the Ephesians, the writer says, in your anger do not sin. So the implication seems to be, it's okay to be angry, just make sure you don't sin in the process of being angry. If you put those four passages side by side, and then you look at other passages in early Christian writing, you see it's kind of complicated, right? When should we be angry? Why should we be angry? What should make us angry? To what intensity, how intensely angry should we be? It doesn't look really, it's not a simple thing. It seems kind of complicated. Let's look at this passage from Aristotle, going from, back to a classical Greek source from an early Christian source. Here's what Aristotle says about anger. He says, the person who gets angry at the right things and with the right people, and also in the right way and at the right time and for the right length of time, is commended. In other words, a person who gets anger right really deserves a round of applause, right? The person who something happens and the person gets ticked, because getting ticked is justified in that moment. The person gets annoyed, right? And being annoyed in that context makes sense. This person, something happens and the person would be justified in being upset, but this person got furious, right? No, that's not getting it right. Or there's a case where, no, this really is something that should enrage a person, but this person is just kind of miffed about it. No, not getting it right. So it's interesting, this idea that getting anger right actually is not easy. And I think most of us have seen it. We've seen this. We've seen it in stores where people get upset about something. We've seen it in our own lives. Perhaps we've seen it in ourselves. We respond in some way and we look back and say, I overdid it. I overdid it. Yeah, I had reasons to be annoyed, but I shouldn't have responded that strongly. Getting angry is, getting angry in the right way, for the right reason, with the right people, to the right level of intensity. That's hard, right? That's tough stuff. And so wisdom would say that anger is sometimes appropriate. It's a sometimes appropriate, but often a destructive force. So that would be kind of a basic moral principle. Yeah, there are reasons to get angry, but be careful, right? And it seems that the early Christian documents are saying that. Be slow to anger, that letter to James says, or that book of James says. Be slow to anger. So there's reason to be angry, but take your time, so to speak. Or that other early Christian document we looked at, in your anger don't sin, right? So there are reasons to be angry, but be careful. So that might be a basic moral principle. Anger is a sometimes appropriate but often destructive force, so be careful. Prudence has to do with acting on these principles in daily life. So in this case, should I be angry? With whom should I be angry? To what intensity should I be angry? And so on. And getting it right, that's tough work, right? And this is the work of people who are in the light. People who are in the light want to get these kinds of things right because they want to have good, productive lives. They want to have good relationships. They want to have good communities. And so to the extent possible, they want to get these things right. They want to know what the basic moral principles are, and they want to work at acting on those principles well in daily life. Now notice that I was just using the word work. Work. This is work. This is hard work. This takes effort. This isn't easy. Which is why Plato suggests that given the option, most people would rather be in the cave. In fact, Plato says that when someone gets out of the cave and becomes enlightened and then wants to go back into the cave, that the people are bothered. They're bothered by this person, right? They don't want to be told this stuff. Plato says they'll even try to kill him. And I think Plato was probably thinking of the case of Socrates, right? Where Socrates is, trying to shake people awake. He's trying to wake them up. He's trying to get them to think about their lives. And people get irritated, and finally they get rid of him. Plato says, the sad thing is most people would rather live in the cave. They don't want to do this kind of work. They don't want to do this kind of work. To live in the light, to see the light, to walk in the light, to be plugged into the light. That takes work, right? To think about, to learn what the first principles are. What does the Logos require? What does the moral law require? How do I put that to work in my daily life? That's hard. That takes work. That takes effort. And Plato suggests most folks don't want to do that. Most folks don't want to do that. The ease of the cave is so alluring, it's so attractive. It's so much easier than the hard work of living in the light, of walking in the light. So the question for us is, what do we want to do? Do we want to take the easy path of the cave? There we are, looking at the shadows, entertained by the shadows. Presumably, life is pretty easy. We don't have a lot of responsibilities, right? We're not working hard at life. We're not working hard at life. But if we go into the light, then yeah, that's going to take work. That's going to take work. The benefit is a life that's probably more meaningful, a life that's probably more full, a life that we're in more command of because we're thinking about our life, probably a life with a greater sense of purpose. So what do we want to do? Do we want to take the comfortable life of the cave, or do we want to get out of the cave and live in the light?